Hello guys, today we are going to go through speciation. Speciation is a process that forms new and distinct species. I want to focus on the word distinct and species. So the word distinct just means recognizably different in nature from something else of a similar type. So by this we mean something that is recognizable but is different because it's a descendant from a similar type. And the word species, now biologists use this word quite a lot, and they use it to define a group of organisms that share similar characteristics, but when they breed, they are able to produce fertile offsprings. And by fertile offsprings, we mean offspring, so the babies are able to reproduce or are capable of reproducing. So let's move on. I want to introduce you guys to this diagram here, and this diagram shows land by the green section and the ocean by the blue section. We have species A living on the land, and using species A, I'm going to show you how a different species is formed by just one simple species. So now the first stage to speciation is geographical isolation, and geographical isolation is the is a geographical barrier that separates the species, and by this we mean something like anything geographical that will separate a species. So we could have land, sorry, we could have a mountain, we can have the sea, or we could even have an ocean or anything like that. And then if we look at an example, we can see that species A is separated. So the species on this side and species on this side have been separated by the geographical barrier of sea. So now that species A have been geographically isolated, let's move on. There's one thing to remember. Now, in species A, there is genetic variation. And by genetic variation, we mean small differences between individuals in a species. And these are genetic differences between individuals in a species. So, if you look at this example of giraffes, we can see that the genetic differences between these species of giraffes are the different skin colors. Okay, and similarly, our example of species A also have these genetic differences. But there are also other differences, such as environmental differences. So if you have environment A here and environment B, environment A might be a little bit more warmer, or it might have different types of food. And because the change in environment can cause this process called mutation. And this is a change in the DNA. So there are two types of variation. There is genetic variation, which is genetic differences between individuals in a species, and there is environmental variation, which is environmental differences in the species. And the environmental differences can cause mutation, which is a change in the DNA. Now, one last thing I want to go over is that genetic variation happens due to the range of alleles. And by alleles, we just mean a version of a gene. So, for example, a gene could be your tongue roll, and the two alleles you would have is you can tongue roll and you cannot tongue roll. So, the next process is called natural selection, and natural selection is when the advantageous characteristic is passed on. And by this we mean the characteristic that is an advantage, so the characteristic that allows the species to survive, is passed on to the offspring. So the characteristic that allowed species A to survive was passed on to the species B. But because of genetic variation, not the whole population of species A would have this characteristic. Therefore, some of the population of species A would die out. But this population of species that did have this characteristic, they would have survived, and as a result, reproduced. Now, the last thing that happens is speciation. And speciation is when the species become so different that they can no longer interbreed. So, look at our example. Now we have species B formed, and we have species A on this side. And what would happen is that if we got species A and species B together, they would not be able to reproduce, or that if they were to be able to reproduce, they would not be able to form a fertile offspring, meaning that species B and species A are two different species. So let's look at the summary. So I think it's quite useful if you get this down, because it can really help to structure your answers better in the exam. So the first thing we talked about was geographical isolation. This is a geographical barrier that separates the species. So anything geographical that will separate the species. And we said this could be a mountain, this could be a sea, this could be an ocean, this could be a land. The second thing we talked about was genetic variation. And genetic variation are differences between individuals in a species. And we talked about that it's caused by the range of alleles, and we talked about different environmental differences as well. And the third thing we talked about was natural selection. This is the process when advantageous characteristics are passed on. So the characteristics that allowed species A to survive were passed on and formed new species called species B. And finally, we have a new species formed, because the species are so different that they can no longer interbreed to produce fertile offsprings. Now, let's attempt a exam style question. So, if we look at the structure here, so just remember the structure. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. Just remember the structure, and it can really help to answer this question. It's a 6-mark question, so it's very important we get this correct, because otherwise we're going to do 6 marks. So from looking at my summary, the first thing I talked about is geographical isolation. Let me say that the ancestral populations were geographically isolated by the geographical barrier, which is land. Okay, so the second thing we talked about is genetic variation, and we say that there is genetic variation between the ancestral populations caused by the range of alleles. Also, there are different environmental conditions. So we said what genetic variation is and how it's caused. And the reason why we have to say this is because the command word here is to explain. And by explain, what the question is asking us to do is to state and then say why it happens. So we said that what happens is genetic variation. So we stated and we say why it happens, because there is a range of alleles, and also we talk about the different environmental conditions. Now let's move on to the next bit, and we talk about natural selection. Natural selection occurs because the advantageous characteristics are passed on. Again, we stated and we said why. And then finally we talk about speciation. Eventually the species have become so different that they can no longer breed successfully. Again, we stated and explained and said why. So let's mark this. So the mark scheme says that we get 1 mark for saying there are 2 ancestral populations separated by a geographical barrier. We have said that right here. That's the first mark. Second mark for saying genetic variation. And we get a third mark for saying different environmental conditions, and we get the mark here. The fourth mark comes for saying natural selection, and the fifth mark comes for saying because the advantageous or the favorable characteristics are passed on. And finally, with the sixth mark for saying this section here. And we have our 6 marks right here. So thank you for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed. Leave a comment below on what could be improved or what you didn't understand, and check out the questions and mark, and I left a mark scheme on there for you guys to mark yourself as well. And hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you for watching, and bye.